Welcome, everyone. This is another episode of TrekWars at OSU, that's Oregon State University. My name is Joseph Orosco, and I am a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University. I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures here at Oregon State. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that try to imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we sponsor is TrekWars at OSU, in which we try to examine the major franchises of Star Trek and Star Wars to see if we can find ways in which these different really big space, sci-fi, fantasy genres help us to understand anything about the social, political, and cultural issues of our day. Today I have a really special guest who is an old friend of mine, and I've invited him to talk a little bit about the ways in which Star Wars influences the way that he teaches philosophy. So my guest today is Professor Terrance MacMullan. He is professor of philosophy at Eastern Washington University near Spokane, Washington. His area of specialization is in social political philosophy, most specifically the philosophy of race, critical whiteness studies, and Latin American thought. And for many years, he's taught a course on Star Wars and philosophy at Eastern Washington. He's also a big cosplayer and does cosplay at Comic-Cons around the region and does lectures at Comic-Con on the philosophy of Star Wars. So I wanted to invite him to come and speak with us a little bit about the ways in which Star Wars influences his work in the teaching of philosophy. So welcome, Terry. I'm really glad that you're here with us.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Joseph.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and just get started. I want to know first, like, how did you get interested in Star Wars? What are some of your first sort of personal memories of becoming a fan of the Star Wars universe?
As is the case for many Gen Xers, I can remember the exact moment when I first encountered Star Wars. I remember this was a rare movie in that my parents, or mainly my dad, was actually very wrapped up in the hype, the anticipation for the film. And I remember I was a kid. I grew up in a beautiful town called Santurce, Puerto Rico, just outside the capital of San Juan. And I remember going on a Friday after school with my mom to see what everybody back then just called Star Wars. And I remember walking in late. I remember walking in on the scene where the Jawa are kidnapping R2-D2. And I just remember being emotionally and psychologically just floored and wrapped up in this film, and wanting to be not so much Luke as really wanting to be Han Solo more than anything in the world. And I developed perhaps a slightly unhealthy connection with this film. I don't know if people remember this, but it was actually in the theaters on and off for about 3 years. It was so successful. I didn't know what a hunger strike was as a little 5-year-old kid, but I just naturally hit upon the political strategy of using that to kind of get a concession from my parents. I literally just stopped eating unless they agreed to take me to see it again. And so my poor parents and my older sister, Sue, took me to see Star Wars a total of 24 times in the theaters over 3 years. I saw it several times in Puerto Rico, saw it in New Jersey, where we lived part of the time, and we even went on a family trip to Toronto. And so I saw it in French at one point. So I think I have a pretty unique distinction on that point. I've, of course, seen all the films, like everybody else. I love some of them more than others, but really I just love Star Wars very much. That's where my connection started.
Well, you're not only a fan, you've taught your class on Star Wars and philosophy now. For how many years have you taught that class?
I have taught this class for about, I'm going to say 6 years. I need to give credit to my good friend, Kevin Decker. Oh, come on. There it is. Hopefully it'll get it. There it is. Kevin Decker is the editor of many of these books on pop culture and philosophy, including 2, I think, on Star Trek and philosophy. So he really gets credit for at least at Eastern trailblazing these particular classes that are just dedicated to a pop culture fandom and philosophy. And so I had, of course, been sprinkling Star Wars examples into just about every class I teach. It pops up in my student evaluations all the time. Like, if you didn't know about Star Wars, you're going to now. So I've been teaching it for about 5 or 6 years, I think. And I teach it at least once a year. Now it's getting to the point that I teach it twice a year because it's a win-win. I enjoy teaching it. I think it's a great way to introduce students to philosophy, and they fill up. And so the deans like it. So they do pretty well.
And some of your scholarship is in sci-fi and philosophy as well, too. You've published articles on Star Wars.
Yeah, that's right. Again, like with my teaching, it's kind of sprinkled throughout. But no, I've also published pieces specifically just on Star Wars. I have an essay in this book on Nietzsche and Plato, and the paradox of a wise Sith, or the paradox of a wise evil person, which Plato would say, stop the film, this is garbage, that's not possible. Whereas Nietzsche would say, actually, you're probably not really wise unless at least a few people think you're evil. And so I use that wonderful scene from episode 3 to unpack the great differences between those two figures in philosophy. And then more recently, reflecting my interest in Latin American philosophy and Latinx thought, I published a piece on Aztec philosophy, and episode 8, we could kvetch, probably the least loved of the Star Wars films. But I think for all of its faults, I think Johnson was going for something really interesting in terms of a new perspective on good and evil. And you see this throughout the film, the whole darkness rises, light rises to meet it, light rises, darkness to meet it. That sounds a little bit like Taoism in the sense that it's acosmotic, in the sense that it's not prioritizing any one of these forces. But the fact that the light and the dark seem to always be at loggerheads rather than hitting some kind of cool, chill balance points much more to a Aztec notion of teot, which is this idea that there are opposites in the world that need each other, that are implicated in each other, but it's not pretty. So it's this idea that everything is produced or brought into becoming through this clash of these united opposites. So yeah, I like writing about Star Wars and philosophy as well.
Well, it's fascinating. Well, I know I'm going to probably like piss off a lot of people with this comment, but 8 is perhaps one of my more favorite Star Wars films because I think it's the most Star Trek of all the Star Wars films.
Oh, that's. Are there long, boring discussions about like trade routes or anything like that? Or there's no? Is there a trial scene? I don't think there's a trial scene.
That's a good point. That's a good point. That's a good point. Good point.
No. The costumes are great. No. Yeah, we could get into that.
Yeah, this is something we could talk about. I'll have to introduce you to some friends. But
yeah,
well, what I wanted to talk with you mostly about were because I teach a class on Star Trek and philosophy, and in fact, I use Kevin Decker's book for my class. Right, so he has blazed a trail for both of us in this way. So my class, and I've talked about this in other episodes, the way that I approach teaching Star Trek and philosophy is with a kind of certain view that I have about the way Star Trek presents its issues. So I think Star Trek has this, has a kind of methodology to it. It's, one, its episodes are often problem-setting ones. That is that they often set up some kind of moral, political, social issue. They problematize it through some kind of allegory. So the stories are a lot of sort of short kind of morality plays in some sense. So they set problems. And this is why I think that a lot of philosophy professors like using Star Trek in their classes, is because the episodes can sometimes illustrate a philosophical problem. But one of the things that I think Star Trek also does is it has this other mode, which I call solution offering. So it not only poses problems, but often it has a take, or it offers a solution to the problem that it presents. So it often has a kind of position on things like racism, or the ethics of artificial intelligence, or the futility of war. That is, it takes a stand.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
when I teach Star Trek, often I present it in both ways. I say, here's a problem that's posed in this episode, and here's what Star Trek or the Star Trek universe has to say about this issue. And then what we can do as philosophers is look at that solution and say, is this a really good way of answering this problem? Is there a really good way of trying to deal with this issue. And I think that this is something that was intentional. It's
Hmm.
part of the work of Star Trek because, you know, the creator Gene Roddenberry wanted a way to be able to talk about social political issues of the day, but he recognized that there were various kinds of limitations posed by the networks and so forth. So he had to propose different kinds of allegories to talk about issues. So I see Star Trek presenting things in this way, and this is how I pose the class, because I teach my class in terms of social, political, ethical issues.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering, do you think that Star Wars has a similar or a different way of talking about um, life? Does it have a different way of talking about or presenting philosophical issues than Star Trek does?
That's a great question. And I think there are cases where you can use Star Wars as a template for um, problem solution discussion, where you can kind of situate yourself, situate a real world problem or moment in the Star Wars films. But I think it has a very different starting point, right? Like you mentioned, Star Trek explicitly comes out of the civil rights movement and what was happening in the 1960s. There's certain episodes that are, I mean, they're very elegant connections to real world moments, but any adult who reads the newspaper and then watches Star Trek will say, oh, that's what this is about, right? Star Wars, I think, being from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, its first movement is to actually, its first movement is in the opposite direction. It unsticks you from the hurly-burly, the particulars of where we live as situated beings, to try to start with some of the, dare I say, transcultural, transhistorical elements of what it is to be a human being, and to try and look at things more as an individual and as somebody who needs myths, somebody who needs these big stories that can be applied anywhere, right? So just like the genius of Roddenberry with Star Trek was to say, wow, he's talking about right now. The genius of Lucas, early Lucas, following Joseph Campbell in this idea of the monomyth, is I'm going to tell a story that's so that just touches on the general archetypes that we'll see used differently in different cultures. But the proof is in the pudding. Almost everybody around the world says, "Oh, he's talking about me." And one of the things that I wrote about in the essay about Teot was there's all these books saying, oh, Star Wars is really about Taoism. No. Star Wars is really about Buddhism. No. Star Wars is really about Christianity. No. And Lucas would say, you're all right. You're all right. So I think Star Wars is about, it's a resource for human beings as individuals, kind of starting with that really deep sense. Who am I? What do I need? How do I relate to the world in a more general way than Star Trek does? Which is why I think when I'm teaching it, I tend not to do the problem, case study, solution, possibility model. I tend to use it as a way to enter into different ancient philosophies, wisdom traditions, and approaches to mythology. So that's why I think Star Wars lends itself really well to different ancient philosophies from around the world.
So it seems that the way that you see this is that Star Trek sort of talks about the sort of the way in which we can think about ourselves, our community, us, right? Star Wars focuses more on the individual quest of the person or the individual to find the meaning of their life in some kind of way, and the ways in which big wisdom traditions focus on the hero's journey and that sort of thing.
That's right. That's right. I mean, everybody wants to be one of the primaries when they're watching Star Wars, right? Every little kid wanted to be one of the big three, right? And you might like R2D2 and you might feel bad for Uncle Owen. But you're basically getting different scripts for who do I want to be and how do I navigate some of the things that in the big picture are universal. How do I make the passage from childhood into adulthood? How do I deal with a system that doesn't care about me? How do I face challenges? How do I make friends? How do I tell friend from foe? How do I return? How do I face my own death? All these basic human stories right? Star Wars, I think, is a lovely way to introduce students to some of the amazing wisdom traditions that humans have developed across the globe in a very handy way. So that's kind of its primary purpose in my Star Wars class anyway.
Well, so could you tell us a little bit about the way in which your class works? Could you give us an example maybe of how Star Wars explores one of these wisdom traditions that you're talking about? So what are the traditions that you try to present? And could you give us an example of how you think that Star Wars can help us to negotiate that tradition?
Sure. One thing I do is I show the films, I primarily show 4, 5, 6, 2, 3, Rogue One. So I show the films in order of production, not in story chronological order. And so when you start with 4, and that wonderful line when Alec Guinness was asked, "What is a Jedi?" He said, "They're samurai wizards." And so much has been written about a great deal of Asian wisdom traditions showing up in Star Wars. In fact, there was a 1972 edition of the Tao Te Ching, the Stevens translation of the Tao Te Ching, where there are lines where you can just take out the word Tao, put in the word force, and you've got a line from Sir Alec Guinness. And so the first thing I do is I teach 4, and I have students read about Taoism and Buddhism. And so we look at these different approaches to what it is to be a human being, different from the Judeo-Christian or liberal or neoliberal orientation that most students are going to start with in the United States. So seeing these different notions of good and evil in there, trying to understand what the force is, this thing that's everywhere, and it's particular and it's general, very, very different from the creator creation model, where God is everywhere, but God isn't the water, right? Whereas a Jedi would say, no, the force, whatever it is, it's there too, right? So to have this very different acosmotic metaphysic. So we do that. And then as we go forward, we do Taoism, we do Buddhism, and then I basically start going in order through some of the Western traditions. So I'll talk a little bit about Zoroastrianism, then Platonism, then Christianity, and Stoicism are kind of the big ancient traditions, ancient wisdom traditions that we look at in order. So by the time we get to say 4, we've moved on to Stoicism, which is a perfect text to talk about these different notions of power that we have, and Stoics correcting you to say, to paraphrase Epictetus's great line, Epictetus was a human being who was enslaved, and he looks at his masters, and he will say, they fly into a rage over anything. Somebody doesn't return their dinner invitation, they're just a wreck for a week. I pity them, because while they have money and they have status and they have reputation, they have no power. They don't have power over themselves, right? And so that's very, very close to young maverick Anakin boasting about what a great pilot he is. Boasting, it's like, come on, master, aren't I a great, I thought I already did rival Yoda as a late lightsaber fighter. And over and over and over again saying, kid, that's not power. That's not true power. And poor Anakin's failure is absolutely at its root a failure to understand what is true power for a human being from a Stoic point
of view. This is interesting. So do you think that, do you in any sense have a sense that the rooting of these wisdom traditions in Star Wars was at all intentional, or is this something that you are able to sort of pull out of the narratives in some way, and that helps explain what's going on with them?
The intentional thing was, and this is very well trodden ground, so I'll just kind of give a summary for your listeners and your viewers, because I'm sure they can find it. George Lucas was a huge fan of Joseph Campbell. Mm-hmm. Wonderful writer, lovely human being, who had this interesting controversial thesis of the monomyth, which is, if you study ancient mythology and ancient traditions, my favorite analogy is it's kind of like a deck of cards. There are these archetypes, there are these formulas, and they're played in different order and in different ways in these different traditions. I think Joseph Campbell is pretty careful to not collapse them all into one, but he's going to say, since these are all traditions about human beings progressing from life from birth to death, they're going to be very rich, meaningful commonalities, right? And so he identifies these archetypes and the hero's journey as being the one story told in different ways in all these different traditions, right? So Buddha goes on a hero's journey, Jesus goes on a hero's journey, and then mythological figures, Gilgamesh goes on a hero's journey. So Lucas loves that, and he says, I want to tell a space story that's the hero's journey. And he says, this is why it was a long time ago and far, far away. And again, also keep in mind in terms of where cinema was at that moment, it was absolutely brutal realism, right? All these films that were very much about tight-grained, tight focus, very kind of realistic dialogue, right? And he says, no, I want to unstick you. I want to take you on a fantasy ride that still matters. So there's this fantasy setting that we have no personal investment with in a political, cultural way, but it hits you between the eyes emotionally, personally, because following Campbell, we have these stories that's kind of like these notes that get hit in all these different traditions. So I don't think Lucas sat down and says, I'm going to put some Stoicism in, I'm going to put some Christianity in, I'm going to put some Taoism in. But following Campbell, following this idea of like, what is wisdom, right? What is evil, right? And so we're going to be able to see different ways of approaching this through these different philosophies. Now, just like, you always tell your students that isomorphism doesn't mean identity. Just because you see two traditions say kind of the same thing, it's dirty pool to say Stoicism and Christianity are the same. It's like, okay, they might have similar positions on issue A, but they're different things. I say that's why when you take a philosophy of Star Wars class, the Force becomes frustratingly muddy, right? Because there are times that the Force has an acosmotic Taoist, Aztec kind of no side is more real than another, and it's just this kind of this metaphysic of balance. But then there are other times when Yoda and Obi-Wan say, if you go down the dark path, it will enslave you. It will make you twisted. It will make you less human. That's cosmotic. That's Augustine Christianity. There is good. Good is real. And it's either you're good or you're less real and you're further away. So in that sense, like in the first four films, no one ever says the light side. There's the Force, which to the Jedi means the normal stuff. And then there's just the dark side, right? It's not like early Christians. They didn't think like there's God's plan and then there's a perfectly other good plan called the devil's plan, and you pick one. There's God's plan, or you're a heretic. Those are your choices.
So, yeah, that's very Augustinian, right? In that kind of sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me see if I understand this correctly, right? So the way that I typically approach Star Trek for my students is that I present these episodes that have these allegories of real life problems that we might be confronting in society today, and what I try to give them a sense of is that there is a philosophy of Star Trek, the sort of Roddenberry vision, which was that the vision of Star Trek is one of a future in which that human beings can accomplish. Like, this is a story of us moving forward, possibly, if we can work out various kinds of problems in our life. This is a possible kind of future that human beings are able of learning from their mistakes and cooperating together. But that Star Trek is a story about us and what we might be able to accomplish as human beings. So it is, there are all these sorts of ways in which human beings can be greedy, self-interested, competitive, all this, but we also need to be reminded of the ways in which we can overcome this and appreciate diversity and appreciate cooperation and dialogue and deliberation. And if we can harness that power, then this is a possible future like that. Mm-hmm. So I often try to tell my students that this is a kind of a humanist vision of what things are possible for us, and that we need to sort of see that we don't need to get stuck in thinking that a certain kind of nihilism about the present, that everything is so awful now and there's nothing that we can do about it. No, in fact, we can have a certain kind of critical hopeness about, right, about the future. Um, it seems that the way that you're talking about how you present Star Wars is a different sort of thing too, is that it's more about opening up a space for a person to be able to do the kind of self examination that's the hallmark, right, of
Mm-hmm.
at least Western philosophy, right, going back to Plato, the sort of self-examination of the soul,
Mm-hmm.
and then that opening can then do lots of different kinds of things for people. Is
Mm-hmm.
that correct? Right? Is that you think that Star Wars
Yeah,
kind of
that's
inspires our self-examination and awareness?
that's right. That's right. I think we're, to put it a little oversimplistically, Star Trek starts at the us or the we, and Star Wars starts at the I or the me. Now, it's not like a solipsistic concern with the individual, because a lot of the questions that come up in Star Wars is, how do you comport yourself towards other people? Um, I remember just being blown away, and so much is written about feminism and Star Wars, especially with the Disney titles, and where we're going now. And the last, what is it, 4 films have had female protagonists. But even though there aren't enough female characters in the original trilogy, there's really just one. Um, she's pretty freaking amazing and stands out from a lot of the female characters of the day. And I remember being a little kid and seeing tiny Leia next to massive Vader, and her just staring him down, and her just giving it right back to them, and modeling, a very stoic, platonic notion of courage. That's absolute. A stoic would be like, good on her. That is exactly what you do when you are threatened by somebody who's unjust but has physical power over you. You don't give in. That's what you do. And even, you know what, maybe there are times that you can run and lie and, shoot your way out of a hallway fight and try and escape. If you know you're right, sure, that's an act of courage. That's an act of practical wisdom. So yeah, I think Star Wars starts with the individual story, but it does give really important lessons about bravery, about compassion. Han Solo first thinking about his own skin and then being like, that's not what a friend is. I need to actually live up to my personal commitments to this stupid farm kid who's going to go get himself killed. If I don't help him, deal with the fact that he bit off more than he could chew. So yeah, I think it starts at the individual, but it does have really important lessons for us as beings in a community.
So I wonder sometimes, when I've taught my Star Trek class, my students often tell me at the end of it all that they may not have been science fiction fans to begin with, but they sort of say, I'm really interested more in science fiction now. Or maybe I'm gonna follow up on watching
Mm-hmm.
some more Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, they appreciate that opportunity to be able to, and maybe in a kind of a safe way, to be able to reflect on problems in the world without having to
Right.
get so
Right.
down into the details of things. But the allegories are interesting to them, and they are sort of interested to see like what else can be talked about. Um, in your experience with your students, how do they react to the opportunity to be able to sit down and have a chance to engage in philosophical reflection through the mirror or the lens of Star Wars?
Mm-hmm. There's 2 big reactions, and it starts with, were they diehard Star Wars fans or not? There's always a cadre of students who are diehard Star Wars fans who think we're going to have an argument about who shot first. Those students often come out with the sense of, wow, there's a depth here that I never appreciated. And they take something that they love and that they care about, which is the pop culture, phenomena, the pop culture fandom, and they use it as an introduction into philosophy. The ones that I find more rewarding are students. These are what we call at Eastern Gecker, or now I guess we call them backer classes. These are general introduction classes. So I get a wonderful cross section of students from different disciplines. And I'll always have students, and I'll make a big deal out of this, where like on the first day I say, like, how much do you know about philosophy? How much do you know about Star Wars? And the people who are like, I've never watched a Star Wars film. And I'm like, I'm going to stretch my human compassion to recognize you as a sentient being, but it's really hard. Joking, of course. Those students who had no previous skin in the game in terms of either Star Wars or philosophy, it's this wonderful moment where they watch the films and they're like, you know, wow, this poor Anakin kid, he needs to get his head screwed on right. Like they can see the problem coming a mile away, and then say, all right, well, what would the Stoics say about this? And how do you make mistakes about what you really are? Is it your grade point average? That's, I mean, when I want to be mean, I just hit them right where I know they're worrying about. Like, are you your grade point average? Do you ever feel like you are that? And like Anakin, I have a great grade point average, therefore I'm amazing. And I can kind of have a swagger and an arrogance to me. Or even the opposite, where I say, no, my grade point average isn't very good. I feel like I'm nothing. Or do you want to be like what the Stoics would say and say, all you can do is do your best in that moment as a moral being and control who you are? And unlike poor Anakin, and you know, ask easy questions. How would things have been differently if, when he is bodyguarding Padme, does he say, hey, stupid, I'm a bodyguard. I don't know why I'm flirting with this woman. I do not know why I'm hitting on this woman. What the heck is my problem? And check himself the way he should. So it actually sets up really easily for this. And in a way, it is kind of like what you were saying with Star Trek, except that it's not very finely textured political. It's, we see moments in the film where something problematic happens, and then we bring it back, not to say a social political moment, but to an individual personal development moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can see how that works, right? My students are often very similar in that regard. That they, what I find interesting is, like, most of my students, when they come in my class, most of them are general education students, right? That they come from a variety of different backgrounds, and most of them are not science fiction fans at all. And what's nice is that after I tell them, look, this class is going to be about Star Trek, they don't drop. So I've never really had that phenomenon, which is cool. But what they tell me often is that I don't really know Star Trek. That's something my dad watches,
Mm-hmm.
but I do know Star Wars. And so by the end of the term, I'm always grateful, because then I've converted a few Star Wars people over to Star Trek in some way or another.
I've literally never had the reverse happen.
Yeah.
I've literally never said, somebody say, like, I know Star Trek, but I don't know Star Wars. No,
No, I think that that's true. Like, so many of my students are always like, Star Trek is this thing that I remember as a kid watching with my dad. So there's
uh-huh,
there's a lot of nostalgia going on
uh-huh, uh-huh.
with Star Trek for people. And typically just for pedagogical purposes, I usually only teach the original series. And so it's the one that usually most people are unfamiliar with. And then it's also, part of it is that, the kind of episodic nature of it
Mm-hmm.
does really well for the morality play kind of
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
scenery, but it also, some of it is just so cheesy that it can, provide a lighthearted moment, right? When you see, some of the really kinds of bad special effects that were
Mm-hmm.
going on. And I try to tell people, no, that was actually pretty cool for the era in which, science fiction was going on, is what you're seeing there.
And
So,
not only that, but it's what you and I are doing right now, right? When you would first see someone's face pop up on the bridge like that, I mean, that's what Star Trek can anticipate, which is really cool. What I mean, discs, communicators like the handheld communicators, things like that. Even we don't have tricorders yet, but we're getting there. And so that's one of the really amazing cool things about it is yeah, it seemed cheesy, but the idea was, well, why can't I just have a really small radio that does other things? And so yeah, Star Trek is pretty amazing. But yeah, the you're getting hit with the enemy's photons and having to grab your furniture and bounce back and forth. They actually had sets that wiggled for Star Wars. The actors didn't have to do that silliness.
yeah, that's a bit of a bonus. And so I wanted to sort of round out a little bit with just a question for you to consider. Um, um, does more recent Star Wars have any kind of wisdom that might help us to reflect on where we find ourselves in the world today? Now, I know that you've been saying that Star Wars is particularly good at sort of the big wisdom traditions, thinking about the big questions about existence in some kind of way. I wonder whether whether more recent portrayals of the Star Wars universe have anything that might help us to think about where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Just real quick, episodes 7, 8, and 9. They have some great stories, some great acting. I think one of the flaws of it as a film is that it's a little too self-referential. Like there's moments in 8 and 9 where they're obviously kind of talking about the reception of 7, 8, and 9, where it gets a little bit solipsistic. Rogue One, on the other hand, is the more I watch it, it's a hair's breadth away from, I think, being the absolute best Star Wars film. When students in my class have never watched the film and they watch it straight through, and I kind of always ask them, like, you know, which one did you think was best? So what is that? Last 3 years I've been able to do that. Students say, oh, there's no question. Rogue One is a real movie. That's what they often say. One of the disadvantages of the Joseph Campbell story is that it's a little too easy, right? It's like, gee, who's the bad guy? Maybe the giant dude in black armor, right? Who can kill people with his mind. Maybe that's the bad guy. Rogue One, everything is murky. There's massive amounts of moral luck. People put in bad situations. You know, Captain, lost his name. Captain Andor, I think. Yeah, Captain Andor, Cassian Andor. He didn't want to shoot his fellow spy. He absolutely didn't want to. He wanted to get the information, and they split up. But you know what? Some stormtroopers came upon them, and the spy couldn't climb. And yeah, I have to kill him. Right.
Yeah, that was a hard moment to watch. Actually, it was gritty and difficult.
Absolutely. And so that one is again, that's the one that is the most like a Star Trek in that it gives us lots of case studies. There's that decision. Oh my gosh, there's Galen Erso going to work for the Empire. That, you know, dismantling the Master's house pretty literally with the Master's tools, right? Can you be a moral saboteur? Can you actually do that? Is the blood of everyone who died in Jeddah, in Alderaan, is that on his hands? Because he did make that. And it's so easy for Khan to be like, well, you don't know that if, you know, don't work for the bad guys because, you know, maybe somebody else will blow it up. But he can be like, no, I know this thing. I know it inside and out. And if I don't get in there and put a bug in it, we're all toast. And the only choice I have, the least bad option, is to work through these things. So I think Rogue One really arrests students. And then I feel of all the films, it's the one that puts us in something like what Star Trek does, a real world scenario, where the right answer isn't obvious. And so this is the strength of philosophy. You know, when I say, you know, things like engineering and medicine are about knowledge, right? If you have something funky with your ankle and you go in to see your doctor and she says, what the hell is that? That's probably, it's not the best doctor, right? I mean, they should know quite a bit about ankles, right? And if you bring your car in and the mechanic says, you've got bad spirits, right? You got a bad mechanic, right? There's certain disciplines that knowledge is their hallmark. But even in those, there's a moment where you say, I can look stuff up, but I don't know what to do. But I have to do something. I can't, even not doing something is a choice. Now, I always say that wisdom is having not so much the answers, but an emotional, moral facility with moving through kind of gray, complicated areas, right? And the only way to do that is to get lots of different layers, lots of different tools that you can draw on to respond to this. Chiro Imwe in Rogue One, like, what is he doing? Just kind of hanging out as this, you know, on the one hand, you see him kick ass. He could take out a lot of stormtroopers. Why is he just sitting there waiting? And why isn't he like so many Americans would say, you see something bad, shoot at it until they take you down. Um, it must have torn him apart to have to watch his fellow priests get killed, his fellow priests of the wills get killed, to see the empire walking around. But there was something really wise in his decision to just stay there and wait and say, this isn't my time yet. And so there's a lot of really real world wisdom in Rogue One. So that is, I've actually had to move it up in like my 10 weeks that I have, because I in the end it was often like the last day, and the students were just like on fire wanting to talk about it, and I'm like, I gotta chop out some things and squish some things in the front of the schedule so I can get to this. And then one other quick note, it's a truism that amazing art comes from limits. Episode 4, the limits were technological, right? I mean, nobody had done a lot of the stuff that Lucas and his colleagues figured out, right? I think part of the problems, forgive me if I offend anybody, with 1, 2, and 3 is that by that point, Lucas was the equivalent of film god. He could do whatever he wanted. He had all sorts of runway ahead of him in terms of the story. He could let things spool out. He could let scenes go as long as he wanted. And there was no limit. And the films have a huge pacing problem, and they're kind of slow and plotting and not that interesting. Rogue One has a brutal narrative bookend at the beginning and a brutal narrative bookend at the end, right? You are right here. Everybody knows how the film's going to end by definition. And when you see Rogue One get blown up by that hand grenade, and you see the traitor communicator pilot get blown up, you're like, oh my God, they're going there. And I remember seeing the film being like, oh, they're all going to die. Because I never saw any of them in episode 4. So man, does that make for amazing film. Kind of like, I think, the great versions of ancient Greek plays. Nobody went to see Oedipus Rex to say, gosh, that's his mom? What the heck? Like, everybody knows the plot before they get there, but they're like, give me the best damn version of this story whose plot I already know. Give me something really particular to hook me in. And I think that works so well. And then the final thing is they don't kiss at the end, which was just like, good for you, right? like if I saw my death coming, I wouldn't be like, romantic moment. No, they're two scared human beings holding each other, which is freaking glorious. I love that film. I love that film.
Is that, do you think that the students who watch it, do they ever say that that's one of their more favorite films of the series? Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, based on the age group, there are a lot of students who just have a kind of like episode 4 hit me between the eyes. For them, it's 1, 2, and 3. And they want it to be Maul, and they love all that kind of stuff. No, I think the more I show it, the more Rogue One rises to the top. It's never lower than second favorite. Let me put it that way. And I think it's because it's the most realized film.
Yeah. No, I would tend to agree with you. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. This has been a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you. And so this was Trek Wars, right? And so, I hope you weren't expecting a war between Star Wars and Star Trek. I think you can have them both, even though Star Wars is obviously better. But yeah, I think you can have them both.
Very nice. Thank you. Well, we'll have to come back to talk about some of these other aspects of Star Wars with some of our other regulars. And
I would love that. And you need to hit up my friend Kevin Deckard, because he just loves being in front of a camera. And so he would. But no, all kidding aside, he's brilliant. His real love, though, is Doctor Who.
So, I know. Well, see, this is why I haven't talked to him, because I'm intimidated by him, because he has an ability to just go through all these different universes like this. He's written or edited volumes in all of these different universes.
Yeah, it's like he's up to 24. It's really obnoxious.
Yeah, that's admirable, but we'll see. We'll talk to him soon. But
yeah, no, I think your viewers would enjoy that. Thank you so much. This is a real honor. I really appreciate it. I love your work, and this is a great forum. Thank you so much for this.
All right. Thank you, Terry. And thank you all for tuning in once again. Please let us know if you have any questions or thoughts. Send us a comment down below, or you can reach us at our social media on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Anarres Project. That's Anarres Project. And if you have any thoughts about the wisdom of Star Wars, leave us a comment down below. Thank you once again, Terry, and hopefully we'll be able to see you soon.
Live long and prosper.